Everyone. I would like to thank DEIC and especially Makinie and Sarah for putting together this presentation and then for later having a moderated discussion. You can see in your screen that this portion of it is being recorded. So the presentation is being recorded, but then the recording will stop once we move into the discussion. But we wanted to be able to have other people share this presentation from Makinie and Sarah. So just a few introductory comments before we begin. We have been discussing racism for a number of years at RTC, and we've been acting to improve our practices and our community to make it a better place for everyone to be. Yet we have a long way to go. We exist within a social political reality of systemic racism, and we have to admit to that and see it and challenge it. It's one that developed in our country for centuries, but because it's been created, it can also be dismantled. And that is really our charge, is to work on dismantling it. And if nothing else, these past few weeks give us a moment to work on that even more, and it's a moment we really can't squander. So we're looking on how can we continue to help RTC become an anti-racist community. And Makinie and Sarah's presentation is going to help us towards that by really helping define things and help understand how people experience, especially race-based traumatic stress, because that's what people have been undergoing for a long time, but in a concentrated manner in these last weeks. And they're going to help us look at, what does this look like for faculty and staff? What does this look like for our students? How can we recognize what is going on in our colleagues and peers' lives? And then how can people manage the symptoms of this traumatic stress? They're going to then go further and look more at white privilege. And then again, from a practical standpoint, how can we really practice allyship and how can we become better allies? So I really appreciate having now on campus behavioral health specialists who can really work with us on this. And so in advance, I thank them for the presentation. I look forward to an engaged discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those words. A special thanks to you and to Cabinet. And also thank you to Dr. Delaney for helping to coordinate and advocate for this happening today.
I also want to thank Student Services, Jessica Gilmore English, and our entire team. Our team has come together and provided a safe place for each other to talk about what we've been feeling and what we've been going through during this challenging time. We want to especially thank DEIC for collaborating with us and for voting to allow us to use this time and have this conversation. We know that you have important work to do, and we appreciate you providing us this opportunity.
We would also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle and Renton, the Duwamish people, both past and present. We are the behavioral health team. My name is Makinie Sarah.
My name is Sarah Hoagland.
We are located within Student Success in the I building whenever we're able to return to Renton Technical College in person. And we provide free and confidential short-term telehealth at this time, counseling sessions to current students. What you'll learn today, what we're hoping you'll learn today for allies, is to learn what systemic racism is, what racial trauma looks like, and how you can support Black students, staff, and faculty. And for any Black students, staff, or faculty watching, we're hoping to help you identify symptoms of racial trauma and look for ways to use coping skills to address it. And also seek allies, if that's something that you'd like to do. When I told my mom that I would be using my voice to be helping to teach about racial trauma, she told me that she remembered watching the civil rights movement when she was 10 years old. And that's something that I really want to kind of bring home, is that this has been a 55-year sort of effort to seek equality. And some would argue that it's lasted longer than that. And I also want to make sure that we are saying the names of the people who have brought us here today. The victims of systemic racism, the victims of police brutality. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tamir E. Rice, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Charlene Rice, Charlena Lyles, Eric Gardner, and Manuel Ellis. We speak because your voices were stolen from us. Before we get into talking about what racial trauma is, we want to help you understand what systemic racism is. We'll start with a couple videos, and we just want to make sure that you have the knowledge of the foundation of racial trauma. So when we start to talk about it, you can see how deep the roots are. The first video is about systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities?
Not sure what's happening, I'm sorry.
This is Jamal, and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
And the next video I'm going to show you is from Dr. Joy DeGroy. She is one of my favorite speakers on racial trauma and systemic racism, and she's going to describe post-traumatic slave disorder.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, and then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about, he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those dinner? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Just a moment. So as you've learned, systemic racism is kind of multi-tiered, and post-traumatic slave syndrome is also multi-generational. So now we can talk about racial trauma and racial battle fatigue with these two other concepts in mind. Racial trauma is race-based traumatic stress. And racial battle fatigue is the physical, mental, and emotional drain after being exposed to microaggressions daily and witnessing the abuse of Black bodies. So it's a combination of what we experience as Black people walking out of the door every day, in addition to what we see when we turn on the TV. Microaggressions come in many forms. They can be subtle, verbal, nonverbal. They can be layered, so not just about race, but about gender. And they can be cumulative. So you can receive it from a group of people at once, or it can be run into a number of people who give you microaggressions, and then you have to be the one to process it. And before I continue, there are additional groups to consider. It is Pride Month, so I do want to acknowledge the Black LGBTQ community. This is a community that is fighting alongside all Black people, but sometimes don't feel like they're supported, because there's a lot of homophobia in the Black community, and this is something that we do need to work on. Another group are interracial couples, and there are kind of two pathways of processing race in America when it comes to interracial couples. The first one is the one that I personally identify with. This is the couple that met and pretty much right away started talking about race relations in America, racism, systemic oppression, racial trauma. So then when police brutality does happen or microaggressions happen, the couple can kind of work through it as a united front. The second pathway is the couple who didn't get the chance to talk about race or didn't feel comfortable talking about race. And then all of a sudden, we're in the middle of a new civil rights movement, and this is kind of thrust into the relationship. And if they're not ready, if they're not prepared to talk about racial trauma, racial injustice, then for the Black partner, it might feel like the relationship is actually adding to the racial trauma. And then finally, biracial children and adults. Thinking about biracial children and adults, there are biracial children who are white passing, and depending on whether they're raised more by the Black family or raised more by the white family, they might have some identity stuff. And then for the children who look more Black, are they welcomed by the Black community? Do they feel welcomed by the Black community? How are they identifying? It's been kind of discussed in a previous team meeting, like there are some biracial children who feel like they are torn between two worlds. So that is something to consider kind of going forward in this. Some of the symptoms of post-traumatic slave syndrome and racial battle fatigue: feelings of hopelessness and depression, anger and lashing out. I put randomly in quotations, and the reason why I did that is because it's not random. As it was described, experiencing cumulative microaggressions on top of witnessing Black bodies being abused can lead to lashing out, and it can lead to just feeling like blowing up, but it's not random. Sleep disturbance, I'll say for myself, I have experienced a little bit of insomnia the last few weeks. It's really hard to sleep when there's constant discussion about police brutality and trying to find ways to work through it. Upset stomach, in part because when our adrenaline system is going, we're in fight or flight, our heart's racing, the digestive system actually kind of stops. And so that can lead to digestive issues as well. And also feeling like talking about racial trauma is unsafe. Feeling like it's not okay to open up and talk about what you're experiencing can lead to kind of the buildup of everything else. And specifically for faculty and staff, and then for students, what this looks like for the RTC community. So for faculty and staff, it might look like, you know, we're just tired, not really communicating in meetings, turning our cameras and mics off, appearing moody. And then for students, it could look like concentration issues, not being able to answer questions, not completing tests on time, not participating in class. But here's the other thing to consider, both for faculty, staff, and for students, is that it might look like there are no apparent changes at all. And that's because we have been dealing with racial trauma our entire lives. Children as young as 5 years old can not only identify race, but can identify racism. They are aware of when someone is expressing prejudice against them. And so this is just something that we've been working through pretty quietly up until recently. Systemic racism also impacts health outcomes. As I was mentioning, when your body is preparing for a confrontation, it might feel a little bit like, okay, heart's racing. That's not good for the body. Black people are 30 times more likely to die from heart disease, 40% more likely to have high blood pressure, and twice as likely to have a stroke. And I do also want to bring context to this. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories, and the first one is personal. Last week, I decided to take the day off. It was just too much. I needed a day to myself. I went to the lake, and there were actually a few other Black people at the lake too. We were all social distancing, minding our own business. Then I look over to my left, and I see two little white ladies walking up. So I turn, and I'm getting ready to say hello when I hear one say, "They always say it's going to be peaceful." So at this point, I'm really looking at them. And Sarah can tell you that I will talk with my eyes before I do anything else. So I'm looking at them. And one of them makes eye contact with me and then looks at her friends and goes, "Those protesters, they're all just gang members." And at this point, I've just broken my neck looking at them, putting my hands together. I'm like, please don't let me go to jail with these two little white ladies. And I let them walk off. But that's something that's internalized. And it does have a long-term impact on our health. The second story I'm going to tell you really quickly is about Christian Cooper. This was a national story that broke just 3 days before George Floyd was murdered. Christian Cooper was in Central Park. He likes bird watching, so he's out and he walks up to Amy Cooper because she has her dog on leash and her dog is just running around. So he politely asks her, "Can you put a leash on your dog, please?" And she ends up using her microaggression and privilege to threaten him by calling the police and saying, "There's a Black man threatening me." Think about what that does to the body and the mind. And continue talking about the impact of systemic racism on health outcomes. Black women are 2 to 6 times more likely to die from complications of pregnancy than white women. And part of this goes back to slavery. Black bodies were experimented on by doctors, and it was determined that Black women were less sensitive and more able to deal with pain. And so that unconscious bias continued and is actually in the healthcare system at this time. That's really something that needs to be worked on. And I would be remiss if I left out the mental health system. Part of why I'm here and part of why I decided to be a therapist was because I want to help deconstruct and improve the mental health system by providing education about racial trauma, not only to colleagues, but to clients. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual is not going to have anything about racial trauma or racial battle fatigue or post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic slave syndrome, I'm sorry. Many therapists and psychologists lack the information and cultural competency to accurately diagnose Black people. So Black people are commonly and overly misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. And that's why it's really important to find a therapist who knows what racial trauma is. Because sometimes seeking help can actually add to racial trauma. What can you do to manage symptoms of racial battle fatigue? Attending events like this is really helpful, I think, because you can begin to identify the symptoms. Once you identify the symptoms, you can start addressing them. So it's really good that you're here if you are a Black participant. It's good to talk to trusted friends and colleagues, and I do say trusted friends and colleagues because you want to talk to people who understand what racial trauma is. And also understand that you're not alone in suffering from this. This is not an isolated thing that only one Black person is experiencing. Because of systemic racism, this is something that many Black people can relate to. I would also recommend taking a social media break. This is something that I had to do, and part of it was because there were a lot of reposting of the images of George Floyd being murdered, and that can be very re-traumatizing. Seeing somebody who looks like an uncle, a father, a brother hurts. You can sign petitions, donate, and protest, but really, I think it would be helpful if you prioritize your own needs. Make sure you're doing things that bring joy. And also, seek a culturally competent therapist. Ask a potential therapist if you feel like you need one, if they understand what racial trauma is. And finally, if you're a student and you need to talk to somebody,
You have the behavioral health team here at RTC, which is Makinie and myself. Just 2 other things that we've added to this screen we wanted to make sure we pointed out. On the screen, which this video / PowerPoint will be available to everyone afterwards, there is a link to the behavioral health website, as well as the link to the behavioral health team's YouTube videos. And we have one on coping skills up right now. Also, if you're an instructor or faculty member and you'd like to have us come talk to your classroom or moderate a discussion in your classroom, we would love to do that. So just contact either one of us or use the behavioralhealth@rtc.edu email address. So I know Makinie talked about privilege in her part of the presentation, and so we wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to talk about white privilege. What is white privilege? White privilege is a series of systemic rights and unearned privileges. Dr. Peggy McIntosh, Associate Director of the Wellesley College Center for Research for Women, wrote an article published in 1989 titled "White Privilege and Male Privilege, a Personal Account of Coming to See Correspondences Through Work in Women's Studies." Later, it was shortened to, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, white privilege unpacking the invisible knapsack. It describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. Examples of unearned privileges are listed in the infographic you can see, such as being able to get to my local library, having a laptop, and being able to purchase the textbooks for my courses. What does it mean? What it means is that I can turn on the TV and see characters that look like me playing complicated, heroic roles. It means I can go to the grocery store and have Band-Aids that are the same color as my skin. It means I am not asked to speak on behalf of my entire racial group. One key point that Dr. McIntosh makes is that it means that oppression and racism take on both active and inactive forms. We are taught as children that racism is individual acts of meanness by members of a group, but we are not taught about how it is also an invisible system of oppression. Dr. McIntosh also states that it's important for us to recognize these things, but it's not enough. Each of us is on our own journey to become an ally. It's a journey we will be on all of our lives. The most basic definition of an ally is that of a person of one social group that supports or stands up with members of another group. More often, this person is part of a dominant group and is standing beside a group that has been marginalized or treated unjustly. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In an excerpt from a paper written and published by the OPSEU, being an ally is more than being sympathetic towards those who experience discrimination. It is more than simply believing in equality. Being an ally means being willing to act with and for others in pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality. Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, said, "It's not enough to be compassionate, you must act." An ally is someone whose personal commitment to fighting oppression and prejudice is reflected in willingness to, number one, educate oneself about different identities and experiences. Number two, challenge one's own discomfort and prejudices. Number three, learn and practice the skill of being an ally. And number four, take action to create interpersonal, societal, and institutional change. The words of Gandhi reflect the spirit of being an ally. Be the change you wish to see in the world. In our next slide, we'll show a video from Asante Bean, who is a video producer, multimedia storyteller, and all-around creative. She worked as the Associate Director of Programming at PBS Digital Studios, especially on something that she was proud of, as written in her website, was being the executive producer of Say It Loud, a PBSDS series celebrating Black history, culture, and achievement. She's going to talk to us about what it means to practice allyship.
Lean on me.
All right.
Lean on me when you're not strong. Hey, it's Asante, and today we're talking about allyship. A big thing to remember is that allyship isn't passive. If there's a war, your allies don't just sit there like, oh my gosh, genocide? Oh, that sucks, man. I can't. It's so hard. I don't get it. People can be so awful. I'm totally on your side.
Just 1 second.
Lean on me when you're not. I believe in you. Good luck! Allyship is an active process that you're always working on. So here are a few steps you can take to be a better ally. First, listen and educate yourself. When people in marginalized groups tell you about harassment or hardships that they're facing because of that marginalization, believe them wholeheartedly. If you feel ignorant in some areas, feel free to ask questions, but maybe ask them to Google first. Trust me, I've asked Google some pretty weird things. It's never offended, and it always has some sort of answer. It's not anyone's responsibility to be your personal tutor on social issues, especially if you're not paying them personal tutor money. There are plenty of resources that are already out there, people who have shared their perspectives in books, articles, YouTube videos. Find the resources that have already been laid out for you. Find the people who are already talking about this stuff online. And as an ally, you should be constantly learning. There's not the Black experience or the queer experience or the experience of being a disabled person. There are so many different ways of walking through the world, being perceived by others, and living at the intersection of various identities and abilities. So even if you think you've heard everything, listen. The second thing that you can do to be a good ally is to uplift marginalized voices. Retweet them, mention them to your friends, highlight them, spotlight them, feature them, hire them, and hire them into positions of authority where they feel empowered to voice their concerns and act on them. Consult with people of color and trans people and neurodiverse people, and then pay them for their time because consulting is a job. Wherever you can, bring diverse people into the conversation. A third thing you can do as an ally is speak up. When you see injustice, when you hear someone being bigoted, call them on their BS. Yeah, it may make you uncomfortable having to point out that someone's being racist, but imagine how uncomfortable Black and brown people feel having to live with that crap every day. It can even be easier to call something out if it's not being directed at you and challenging your very existence. As an ally, you can take that burden off of someone who is already hurting. And if you remain neutral in that sort of situation, you're not an ally. You're not helping. Some people also worry about it being not their place to, for example, speak of issues of race if they're white. But speaking up about injustice isn't the same as speaking for a marginalized group. It is everyone's place to call out problematic behavior, especially since as an ally, you're in a position of privilege and have less fear of retaliation. White people who are slightly racist are more likely to listen to other white people, so as a white ally, it's on you to get your people. Go get your mans. Whose mans is this? Your relatives are likely to listen to you because they usually care about you at least a little bit, and you kind of can't avoid them. So when you're sitting around the table and your auntie acts like people can't be bisexual, call her on it. That is your role as an ally. Bring a supportive voice to the table at tables where I'm never invited to sit. Reach your communities that I don't have access to. Use your privilege to speak where other people would be silenced. Another thing you can do as an ally is to respect safe spaces. Everyone wants to come home at the end of the day. Sure, I may be up for academic debate of politics and social issues, but there are some times when I don't want to be challenged. I don't want to always have to be playing defense. Sometimes I just want to be around other like-minded people with similar experiences who get it. It's empowering, it's strengthening, it's emotionally enriching to be able to fellowship with people without judgments or pretenses or awkward questions just from being who you are. Don't take issue with people coming together around their identity, especially since if you're in the dominant culture, you probably get to do it all the time without even trying. Respect that there's Pride Month, respect that there's Black History Month, and realize that as an ally, the world is already suited to you in that respect. If you're straight and cis, you've probably never feared being threatened for expressing your gender or felt like you needed to hide your sexuality. If you're white living in a dominantly white country, you've probably always seen people who share your heritage in the history books. If you're able-bodied and neurotypical, you probably have never been stopped from entering a common space because it's inaccessible, or had to retreat from a common space because it's overwhelming. Respect the spaces and times of year where people who are usually sidelined get to take center stage. If you're an ally, you'll be fine with the fact that this is not about you, and sometimes that means politely excusing yourself from spaces meant specifically for marginalized groups. The fifth thing that you can do as an ally is to get to work. Yeah, you gotta do the work. Use your strengths, your access, your resources to help the cause. Protests can be great, but we're not all meant for marching in the streets. You can call people in the government, you can financially support community programs, you can volunteer for supportive organizations. If you're a lawyer, you can give pro bono counsel. If you're a doctor, you can get involved in a clinic. Whatever you do can probably be used to do good for marginalized communities. And if you want more ideas on quick action steps you can take, check out the video I did on the Resist Challenge a while back. Being an ally is an active process, and it's not something that you bestow upon yourself. You don't just get to say, I'm not transphobic or homophobic or racist, therefore I'm an ally. Check. We are always unlearning the prejudices we've been socialized in, and we're all problematic in our different ways. True allyship involves valuing people with experiences different from ours, learning about our privileges and natural prejudices, and working to make the world more equitable in spite of them. In the comments, let me know how allyship has played out in your experience, or how you think folks could be better allies. You can like this video if you liked it, subscribe to see more, and if you want to help me make more and do more with this channel, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Totally up to you, but I would greatly appreciate it. As always,
So this is summarizing what Asante said about how to practice allyship. Chelsea Paulson and I were recently discussing how to practice allyship, and she said, remember, we're practicing allyship. We don't ever arrive as an ally, and we as individuals don't get to call ourselves allies because we as white people are not the best judge at deciding if we are being allies or not. So RTC practices allyship. There is a link here. The link for information is rtc.edu/solidarity. If you are interested in getting involved on campus, there's a list of places on campus that you can be a part of in order to further this discussion and further your education. On the left is for staff and faculty specifically. We have the DEIC Council. They're the ones who partnered with us to provide this presentation. Thank you again. The Faculty and Staff of Color Network, and then Whites for Accountability. And then for students, joined with faculty and staff is Men and Women of Merit.
Do protests make a difference? Yes, absolutely they do. I just want to highlight 4 major differences that I was able to track. I started this list the week that George Floyd was murdered because I was having a hard time finding hope. And one thing that both Sarah and I do when we're working with clients is say, why don't you make a list of things that you're grateful for. So I kind of twisted it and made a list of changes that I saw. And in just 8 days of protesting, we've seen all 4 of George Floyd's murderers charged. An anti-lynching bill that hopefully will be voted on very soon. Participation in marches in all 50 states and internationally. But more importantly, we're seeing Black people taking off the mask that society has forced on us to be less threatening to society. We are being more authentic and outspoken about what we are experiencing every single day. And that's really important.
Faux pas of Zoom 101, right? Being on mute. Here's some resources that RTC has available to all students. Beyond 2 amazing therapists, there is there's the advising team, there's the Disability Resource Center with Jake, there's enrollment services, there's financial aid, the LRCC with Ty and all of his students who do such amazing work. Wade and Veteran Services. There's tons of options. If you are a student or even a staff or faculty member who doesn't know about these resources, let one of us know and we're happy to point you in the right direction to get in contact with people who work in these areas. And then here are some of the many links that we have in regards to the sources that we used in order to provide this presentation. I think there's 2 pages. Yep, 2 pages. And next is action steps. So we wanted to make sure that part of the end of this presentation was really specifically related to action steps. These are a few. There were so many that we had to list that the font is very small. We apologize. And there are a ton more of options. So on here, we have a few. Also, the rtc.edu/solidarity has a lot of options as well. Some of these are calls and petitions that you can sign. Some of them are donation options. Some of them are social media actions. There's books or articles to read, and there's also some videos available to watch.
One more shameless plug.
There are 2 behavioral health therapists on campus if you are a student. There is Makinie
And Sarah.
And we are here to talk to you if you have anything that you'd like to discuss.
And this PowerPoint will be available on the Behavioral Health Team SharePoint. I have the link there. And I just want to give some final thoughts. To allies at the RTC community, the Black community, or at least myself, just wants to say thank you for being there for us. We know that there's a lot of work to do. No institution is perfect, but allowing us to start with a discussion is really helpful. And thank you so much for not adding to that racial trauma. We know that there's some work to do, but to the allies, thank you. And to Black students, staff, and viewers out there, I just want to say we are not descendants of slaves. That is not our heritage. We are descendants of villagers, voyagers, empires, people who built things and created music. Slavery was an interruption in our story. We are beautiful people. We deserve to be treated equally. And we can start, at least within the RTC community, right here. Thank you.